This is CISC 326, Week 1, Chapter 2, Background Information and Resources. And as the text says here, in this chapter, we're going to discuss what is Linux, why use Linux, what is Ubuntu, Ubuntu for business, Ubuntu for your home, getting the most from Ubuntu and Linux documentation, Ubuntu developers and documentation, websites and search engines, mailing lists, and internet relay chat. The author states here that it's worthwhile to learn about the history of Ubuntu and Linux, and we're going to learn about resources where we can learn more about it on our own. So what is Linux? Linux is the core or kernel of a free operating system developed by Linus Torvalds in 1991. Now, 1991 wasn't that long ago. He was very committed to open source and free distribution of software, and luckily for all of us, he decided to distribute Linux under a free software license called GNU General Public License, GPL. The GNU GPL was created by another smart individual, Richard M. Stallman, founder of the Free Software Foundation. Now, he's the author of Emacs and the GCC compiler system, and crafted the GPL to ensure that software that used the GPL licensing would always be free and available in source code form. So all of this adds up to the fact that the combination of all these people's efforts and generosity, that GNU software and the GNU GPL and Linux will remain forever free and unencumbered by licensing or royalty issues. Next is a discussion of the distribution number and kernel numbering schema. And the discussion here is about the kernel numbers such as 4.14.0-22, for example, which represents the major version, 4, minor version, 14, and patch level 0. So let's take a quick look at that. We see uname here, Linux, and let's try uname --help. We'll see all the things that we can find out, and I do believe it mentioned the -v and the -r. So let's uname -r. There's the release. The numbers we have there, 4.15.0, and uname-v, kernel version. And we see the date it was compiled. So Linux is free software. And when you combine the Linux kernel and the GNU software tools that include drivers, utilities, user interfaces, and other software such as X.org Foundation's X Windows system, that creates a Linux distribution. There are many different Linux distributions from different vendors, but many are based on the Debian Linux distribution, and Ubuntu is one of them. Now, Debian lists several dozen other Linux distributions as being based on Debian Linux, and you can see the link here. And the author mentions that when people say they use Linux, they actually mean they use one of the distributions. For example, they're using Ubuntu Desktop, while Linux really refers to the underlying kernel that the distribution is based upon. Now, when we take a look at a distribution such as Ubuntu, there is a suite of software that includes several things, and we're going to take a look at that. Linux runs, actually, it's the grub bootloader runs, after your BIOS, which nowadays is actually more accurately called EFI firmware. But after your BIOS runs, it's going to hit your grub bootloader, and it's going to allow you to run Ubuntu or maybe run Windows if you have a multi-boot setup. So after BIOS is invoked and it runs, it hands off to the grub bootloader, and we read about that in Chapter 1. The Linux kernel starts up which is going to be described in chapter 22. And as the Linux kernel starts up, it fires up some daemons. Now, you can pronounce that daemons or demons. Either one's fine. I'm going to call them daemons. And what they are processes that are run in the background, and they're not associated with a given user. In Windows, they might be called Windows services. They run in the background and provide services. Same thing here. Daemons run in the background and provide services. There's a discussion here about the shell, and we'll be looking at that when we cover chapter 14, automating tasks and shell scripting, and shell utilities. We'll be touching on those even before that in chapter 10 and 11 and 12. We're going to be looking at the X server in chapter 3, working with GNOME next week. We'll also be looking at desktop software such as web browsers, office suites, media players, games, and such. So, a Linux distribution like Ubuntu collects all of these together, packages them, and makes them available to end users as a convenient set. So why use Linux? We'll skim over this because one of the reasons we're going to use Linux is, the name of this class is Linux Systems. We need to learn about Linux. And as I've said before, we're looking at Ubuntu in particular. There are various reasons to use Linux. Obviously, there's an excellent return on investment since a lot of distributions are free. You can read about it here. Linux can be put to work on the desktop with the X Windows system. Little known fact that Mac OS X is based on a Linux kernel. And the author mentions here that on the DVD there are more than 800 software packages, including internet connection, utilities, etc. So that's something to look at. And Linux can be put to work as a server platform. As a matter of fact, a lot of internet servers are based on Linux kernels and or Linux distributions. Linux has a low entry and deployment cost, obviously, since it's free. Linux appeals to a wide audience in the hardware and software industry. You can read about that here. Provides a royalty-free development platform for cross-platform development. That can be important for developers. And there's big player support in the computer hardware industry, such as IBM, which now lends credibility to Linux as a viable platform. So what is Ubuntu? As we've discussed, Ubuntu is a distribution based on the Linux kernel, which was created, improved, refined, and distributed by the Ubuntu community and sponsored by Canonical Limited. It was first released in October 2004. As I mentioned previously, it has a reputation for ease of installation and use. Ubuntu is based on the Debian distribution, which has a lot of support. And it's sponsored by Canonical Software with the resources of Mark Shuttleworth, starting with Warty Warthog. There's a discussion here about Ubuntu version numbers. So, for example, 18.04 indicates that it is the April 2018 release. And LTS stands for long-term support. We'll be using the LTS versions. There's a discussion about the wacky internal names used for Ubuntu development. The text discusses using Ubuntu for business. You can read through this. Here's a discussion of Ubuntu use in your home, and it really is a viable environment for your own personal use. The author discusses the official documentation on the DVD, but you can go to ubuntu.com to find links to various Ubuntu documentation projects. There's a lot of information that you can find on Ubuntu, and a lot of people who will be willing to support you in any questions that you have on Ubuntu. You You can use the man utility to find out information. A lot of discussion about documentation here. The author mentions here, along with the full distribution, you get access to the complete source code for the Linux kernel and source code for all software in the distribution. That's staggering. Now, most people, they would find that staggering. But it is pretty interesting that you can grab the source code and rebuild any part of the Linux kernel and much of Ubuntu itself to suit your particular needs if you are an advanced user. There's a discussion here about Ubuntu developers and documentation, websites and search engines. You can read this on your own. Discussion about Google and how you can find information using Google. There's various ways you can get support, including support from Dell and IBM. You can also join an Ubuntu local community. All sorts of information on Ubuntu. And mailing lists. Here are some important mailing lists. I have joined these mailing lists, and you can elect to join these mailing lists, and you can also elect to get a daily email with any activity that are related to these mailing lists. I suggest going ahead and subscribing to these mailing lists and finding out what kind of information is being discussed and whether or not it pertains to you, because you can always unsubscribe. Internet relay chat facilities to be able to have interactive chats with people who are willing to discuss and support Ubuntu in its various flavors. It's a good idea to take a look around and to log into some of these chat servers and see what kind of topics are being discussed on these channels and see maybe which ones are more appropriate for your use. And that's the end of Chapter 2. I'm James Millington, your CISC 326 instructor. Thanks for watching.